We're live.
All right.
Welcome to Microcollege. Today our guest is Julie Shackelford. Julie has been an instructor at the International People's College, which is a folk high school in Denmark. A number of exciting ideas to learn about there. Many new, I'm sure, things that people in our audience haven't heard of before. So welcome, Julie.
Well, thank you, Jacob. It's great to be here.
Our guests, we'd like to start off with a question about your background, but I would frame it this way. If you think back to when you were 20 years old, or at the age of most of our students, or roundabouts, where were you, and what was great about what you were doing then, and what do you wish was different?
All right. So 20 years ago, literally, well, not quite. I would have been packing my bags on a trip to Paris. I was studying at UWM in Milwaukee, and I was fascinated with French culture and French civilization. And so I was doing a study abroad for a month in Paris, very cleverly named Summer in Paris. And actually, when I did go, and for the month of July, I loved it so much, I didn't leave. I stayed for a year and lived in a bookstore for a while, and actually studied for a bit, and then decided that living and experiencing life in Paris was more important in that time, in that moment. And it was fantastic. I think, what would I have done differently? I don't know. It completely changed my life. It was the first time I'd lived abroad, and I have continued to do so for most of my adult life since then. It was a very pivotal moment in my life.
So this was essentially a self-created gap program, essentially.
Exactly, right. So I had no intention of, quitting school or anything like that. I had was only going to do it for a month. I had already paid the down payment on my apartment and tuition for the fall term, and literally, actually, I came home because I had a return flight at the end of July. I told my roommate I was moving out. I canceled school for a year. I did all those things, and within, I think, a week or two, I was back in Paris and working as an au pair and doing all sorts of odd jobs and things like that. But so it was not an intentional plan. It just kind of happened. I felt from the moment that the plane landed in Paris that I was home. And I felt that as long as I continued to feel that way, I needed to explore that. And I have, in different ways. Although home has changed location over the years.
So you've gone on to make a career as an anthropologist,
correct.
Right? And would you say, can you connect that experience there to your path as an anthropologist?
Yeah, so I lived in France for a year, then went back to UWM for a year, and I was already studying anthropology at the time, but had been looking more at the Hispanic world, learning Spanish and that sort of thing, and so I switched after my year in Paris, and so focused more on the Francophone world. So it's very kind of a roundabout way, but during that time in Paris, I had a few experiences that were very, what do I say? Like there was, for example, Islamophobia and prejudice towards people from the Middle East and North Africa, which wasn't at all what I thought would draw my attention. But so over that year, I kind of became aware of this. And of course, this is right after September 11th, and these emotions are running high, both in America and beyond. And so I started to think about it a bit more, and I went back to France. I lived in a very small town. I was teaching English for another year, and had some more experiences while I was there. And I thought, I love France. I love the culture and the language and everything about it. But I just felt it wasn't enough, and that was for me. And I need to do something that was for more than just myself. So I went home and I finished my degree, and then I applied to do a master's in Middle East Studies.
Wow.
So completely switching fields again, still anthropology, but now learning Arabic and teaching myself Arabic actually with the Rosetta Stone program. And then ended up doing a master's at the University of Chicago, focusing on the anthropology of the Middle East. From that point on, I started to focus more and more on Syria, which was seen as the safest country in the region. And,
Wow.
So
that sounds different from today.
Yeah, right, yeah. So initially, actually, I'd planned to, for various reasons, actually look at Iraq, but it was unsafe. So Syria was, quote unquote, the next best thing. And safer, but culturally somewhat similar. And so I went to Syria, and it was still during the peacetime, and it was wonderful. I met my husband during that time. I was doing kind of anthropology and archaeological work in the desert city of Palmyra.
Wow.
And it was fantastic. I was working with the Bedouin and loving, the work that I was doing. And then, of course, the uprisings began and the Arab Spring. And I happened to be in Damascus, the capital city, when it all happened. And the roads got closed and we couldn't leave. And so spent most of that time in Damascus, went to Palmyra a few times, and then, eventually had to leave the country because it just simply got too dangerous. And then went to Denmark because my boyfriend at the time, now husband, is Danish. And he... we didn't really know what to do, so we went there to kind of regroup and figure out what to do. And there was a folk high school up the road called the International People's College. And he said, I think you might like this place. And he was right.
Wow, fantastic segue there. I mean, I think that the story, what you said about, just the path of history that you got to have a front seat through there in the Middle East and also in France there. It seems like an interesting segue to being involved with a folk high school. So, for many of our listeners, many Americans, this idea of a folk high school it's a set of words that don't necessarily fit together. So maybe before we go any farther, could you give your sense of what is that concept? What is a folk high school?
Well, folk high school, to me, it is something that is uniquely Danish and Nordic in tradition. The folk, of course, means you can translate it directly and say, okay, that's the people. And a high school is kind of a higher education, in Denmark for adults. But that kind of loses the meaning, right? A folk high school was really for the people. It was, it came about by the founder, NFS Grundtvig, who actually never had his own folk high school, but it was his idea. And Christian Kohl was also a big part of it. And they really, it was a crazy time in Denmark and in Europe and the world. There was all sorts of revolutions happening again.
What years were these?
So if we look at post French Revolution. So I think for Grundtvig that was very important because he was a young man, and when it happened, he remembered it, and he was very influenced by it. And so in Denmark, the Constitution, I think, was 1849 that it went into effect. But 1848 was a huge year in Europe.
All around the world, yeah.
Exactly.
That's one of those watershed years of American history, too. The Seneca Falls Conference and Henry David Thoreau went out into the woods.
Exactly, right? I mean, it's massive. And so at that moment, Denmark was shifting from this absolute government, this absolute monarchy, to a democracy, And so the idea of folk high school it was truly for the adults, the people of this new fledgling nation Denmark is an old nation, but this new fledgling democracy to become part of it and to be active in it. And so it's tied to this really, kind of revolutionary spirit, but a bloodless revolution, right? And just this sense of empowerment. That's really quite profound and really untranslatable in many ways.
Yeah, I think that's this word democracy is thrown around. It's lost its currency in a lot of ways. But a democracy, and I think this story emphasizes it, requires a people, a folk, right? A demos, right, in the Greek sense, right? There needs to be a people who are ruling in order for democracy to work, and that doesn't just come about. Right, and so that Grundtvig's insight was really profound in that sense. How do you take a group of peasants, people who are disconnected from each other, living in a particular place, and have a sense of, yes, we are a people. We can rule. We can have shared ownership, let's say, of this country.
Mm-hmm. And make decisions. I mean, you have to remember, it's hard for us to comprehend, but in an absolute monarchy, I mean, there's only one decision, one voice that mattered, and that was the king. Right. And so it was irrelevant what your thoughts were, your opinions were. And so many people, if they even formulated them, that was, exceptional, right? And because there was no point, right? It wasn't relevant to your day-to-day life. So just teaching, and fostering an environment where people could have opinions was exceptional, right? Was revolutionary in its own right.
So historically, these are young adults from rural backgrounds in Denmark. And I guess before we get to the International People's College, which is the modern manifestation of this, do you have a sense of in those historical folk high school contexts, what was going on there? What was the activity of the students, you could say, of those schools?
Well, it was a bit mixed. I don't know precisely, all the different folk high schools, but I know Rødding Folk School, which was the first. There was, manual labor involved, but also kind of more academic, stimulation of the mind, stimulation of the body. They talk about the head, heart, hands nowadays, but kind of that holistic 24-hour person. This idea of, that you aren't just your brain or just your hands, right? Yeah. You have to combine them all together and to be a full person. So
head, heart, and hands is part of the language of the folk high schools in Denmark today?
It is, actually, the Folk High School Association.
So that is, the one kind of well-known motto of Waldorf schools as well. So that's an insight into human nature that's common, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Microcollege is recorded in the broadcast studios of WDRT Viroqua 91.9 FM Driftless Community Radio on Main Street in Viroqua, Wisconsin. Thanks to Jim and all the folks at WDRT for the support of Thoreau College and the Microcollege podcast.
So you have this direct experience as an instructor and a participant. Were you living on the campus of the International People's College?
No, we actually moved almost directly across the street.
Okay.
So we're very, very close. And at the time there was no place available, but we basically lived there, just a little bit away.
So International People's College. Yeah, could you describe that to us? What is it like?
Yeah, so International People's College, or IPC, was started actually 101 years ago by a man, Peter Manneke. So they just had their 100th Jubilee. We actually just celebrated in May because of COVID and things. There was an internal celebration last October and then a more kind of external celebration in May. And basically it was started just after World War I. Where Peter Manneke, who had was kind of almost Quakerist in his belief system, and had spent some time with the Quakers in England, and also at Fearcroft College over there. And he was very moved, and he really did not want to ever see what happened in the Great War ever happen again. And his idea was to basically take the Danish idea, which was also linked to nationalism and creating the Danish person, right? And that was also related to the relationship to Germany, and that was a complex history there. Creating the sense of Danishness. But Peter Manneke wanted to take it one step further and to create and really focus on humanity. And he felt that particularly working side by side, working for peace, didn't matter what language you spoke, it didn't matter which side of the war you were on. He was adamant he wanted, both Germans and Englishmen and people from those opposite sides to come together and work side by side. And maybe, take classes in the evening, whatever it was. But do the dishes and dig the ditches and whatever. They actually built our lecture hall. The students did, and through that fellowship, what they call fellesskab, which is kind of togetherness. We would create the solidarity and create this feeling of brotherhood or sisterhood and real humanity. You wouldn't see, a German. You wouldn't see a Russian. You would see a person. You wouldn't see a teacher, you wouldn't see a principal, you would see a person. And that was what he was trying to do. And, I think to a large degree he succeeded. He was there for many years. I think he died in 1981, and then has been succeeded by others. He wasn't principal the entire time. He did retire earlier, but he was definitely a very vocal participant for many years afterwards.
Well, just think of all the history that happened between the 1920s and 1980s.
Exactly, yeah.
In Europe.
Exactly. So, so it's continued over the years. I know I think 1988 it was actually declared by the UN as a messenger of peace. I think that was also the year we have there was a peace poll, and there's one in Madison as well. I think they're all over the world now. May peace prevail on earth.
I think there's one here in Viroqua, actually.
Is there?
Yep.
Interesting.
Yep.
I'll have to find it.
I think it's actually right across the street.
Seriously?
One block down.
Oh my goodness.
From where we are here
That's
at the
fantastic.
studio of WDRT.
Okay. Yep. Oh, fantastic. So I mean, it was very much, today it's considered a peace school and working towards active global citizenship. And just, again, but still bringing people from all across the world together. I think this last term we had students from 28 countries around the world, living in community and residential living for 6 months. Yeah. And the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yeah. And
peace, right?
Exactly, and learning, how to create democracy, with regard to the student kitchen and, all of these different things.
Great. So let's get into those nuts and bolts. Yeah. So I think when what I've found in really my whole career as an educator in alternative education, experimental education, it's possible to get to talk about ideas and also the atmosphere around a place, but miss actually some sense of what is actually life like in this place. So maybe we could start. How many students are typically part of the campus there at IPC?
Generally around 100. They've just expanded the campus a bit. So with the new facilities, I think 109 is the cap at this point.
And the students are all living on site there? Correct.
And it was actually decided, the option was discussed, should we expand the residential aspect and create more dormitories for more students to come? And they actually decided against that. They felt that 100, 110 was basically kind of the cap that you could create a community where everyone would live together and could know each other by name. When you get beyond that, it becomes more difficult. That was actually a conscious decision to limit the number of additional rooms they created.
And how does that size compare to other folk high schools in Denmark? Do you know?
I think it's pretty average. I know there's some that are only around 60, some that are upwards to 200, but then they also, I think those larger ones have kind of the long-term student residential areas and then maybe guests or short-term courses that are happening at the same time. So they're all very different. In the Folk High School Act, there's certain kind of requirements by law that you must fulfill to be a folk high school, but there's a lot of diversity within that. I think each school can decide many things for themselves. Yeah.
And so you live across the street. Are most faculty or other staff members living on site there nearby?
Most actually live on site, I would say. A few commute from Copenhagen or from, again, the local city community area.
So, and what is that setting like? What kind of is it in a rural place? Is it an urban place?
It's relatively urban, but it's actually kind of on the cusp. So it's in Elsinore, which, if anyone is probably most familiar with the city, is from Hamlet. So it's the location of the fictitious the story from Shakespeare. So there's Hamlet's castle, Kronborg Castle is right there. It's a very kind of touristy area, but very sweet. Kind of has this old city center, and so we're kind of just maybe a mile and a half up the coast, up the hill from there, and that's kind of right where the rural areas begin. So we're right kind of between those two, but easy to get to by train or car or anything like that. So it's got a nice mix. It's not really in the middle of nowhere like some other folk high schools, but it's not in the center of Copenhagen either. So there's a few that actually are, I think one is in Copenhagen is not residential because there's simply no space in the city. But the vast majority are rural. A few are like us where they're kind of in smaller cities but on the outskirts.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because as we've been exploring microcolleges and other programs that we really see as peers here to Thoreau College, many of them are rural or even indeed in wilderness locations like Deep Springs. And there's something about the community that's created by isolation or by a close connection to the land in some place. So it is a question that comes up: is this possible? Does it work in a context where you've got a larger population, you've got distractions, you could say, of culture and things like that? Is it when a student is there, is it a bubble within the wider community, or do people connect with things outside?
It is absolutely a bubble. I mean, they talk about the IPC bubble, and they actually encourage students to get outside of it. So there's a program we started. Actually, I helped to start again after many decades of not happening, called Dining with a Dane, where students go out to a family. Actually, they think they go in groups of 2 or 3. And we kind of try to mix by region where they're from. So maybe someone from the Americas, someone from Europe or Africa, and someone from Asia. And then they spend an evening with the Danish family and have dinner. And then afterwards, we invite all the families back to the school, and we do performances and just have a very nice, cozy time. And so it's part of a kind of IPC Elsinore Exchange Club that I'm a part of. So maybe we do hikes and other things too. But so I mean, we do try to integrate them a bit more into the community, but that really, they are their own bubble as well. You know, the students, some barely leave it. But yeah.
So how long are they typically there?
The spring term is 6 months, and then the autumn term is 5 months. If you take, we have a Danish and English summer program that lasts 3 weeks, so it can extend the autumn program a bit longer. So they're more equal to each other if you take that. So the autumn term is a bit more of a whirlwind than the spring.
Yeah. So, and the students are, as you mentioned, from all over the world, 20, 30 countries around the world. So the language of instruction is English, correct?
Correct. And that's by law. We're the only folk high school that is allowed to teach in English. All other folk high schools must teach in Danish.
And all the courses are in English?
Correct. Yeah.
And so that's, is there some sort of a language kind of test or evaluation, or how do people have, qualify? Or maybe you could just say in a larger sense, how does one sign up to join the IPC?
You can just go to the website, International People's College, IPC, I think, I don't even know actually, .dk, I imagine. Just go to the website, and you can easily register, and it has all the details there. You don't have to take an English exam to qualify, but they do, if you need to take an English class. I think we have English 1 and English 2, and it's basically what you feel the level is that you are. And then for other students, the classes are open to all, and that's a big part of the folk high school. Is that I believe it's 60%, although it might be even higher than that. But a large percentage of the instruction must be of a general nature by law. So you can't be specialized. You can teach on different topics, but it has to somehow kind of relate to the universal condition of humanity in some way, so that people can identify with it. So, for example, I teach a course on Middle East Studies called Approaching the Middle East. So yes, we do look at a lot of things about the region, but we always try to bring it back to the larger, larger humanity, larger principles at play.
So have you been an instructor at college university level here in the States?
Not in the U.S., but I did my PhD at University College London. And so I did work for a time just as a teaching assistant in the anthropology department there.
I mean, could you compare your experience teaching there, or also, let's say, just being a student here in the States? Like, how are they similar or different to being teaching a course or being a part of a course at a folk high school?
I think they're vastly different. If I think back to my time, for example, at UWM in Milwaukee, or even Madison, where I studied Arabic for a while, classes tend to be a lot larger. There's a hierarchy between the teacher who has the knowledge and the students who want to acquire it, and the kind of banking model that. I'm blanking on the name. The Brazilian Paulo Freire talks about, right? This banking model of education.
Pedagogy of the oppressed.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so very much, and it's contractual, right? I pay a certain amount of money or I'm taking out loans. I expect a certain quality product that will then, get me the job that I want, right? It has this idea. And that is not at all what a folk high school about. So a folk high school has kind of three legs of the stool. And the first is education for life. So it's not a time, between 18 and 21 or whatever it is, or 22 that you are there. It's at any time. I think our oldest student we had a few years back was 81. That's the oldest in recent memory. I'm sure there's been others, perhaps older. And so learning for life is a crucial. There's also self-enlightenment. And so that is that it's for you. So you're not learning it to be a cog in someone else's machine. You are learning because this is what you are interested in learning about. And then the third is the active democratic participation, or in our case, active global citizenship. And so that is really, you learn these things not just for you, but also for the well-being of others and for a good quality of life in all aspects. And so that university or college in the States and elsewhere, and traditional forms of education, that's not what they're about, actually. Right. At their core, that's not what they're about. That's not their purpose. They are very much to keep a status quo of a certain lifestyle, of a certain society, in meeting the needs of certain industries and this sort of thing. And that has its place too. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It should always be looked at critically, I think, and make sure that, if any tweaking needs to happen, that it can. And traditional education has its place to maintain a certain culture and way of life. But the non-traditional forms, I think, kind of spice it up, and they remind people that they have that learning is about so much more, right? And it can be a joy in itself. We are meant to learn. We are designed to learn. We have our brains. We don't have claws. We don't have, sharp teeth. We have brains, and we have, this thirst to just know more and be more. And folk high schools, I think, just try to cultivate that and really embrace that and cherish and celebrate it.
It's so refreshing to hear. Those three legs of the stool there are close, near and dear to the impulses here of Thoreau College, I would say. And I think that they address in different ways so many of the challenges and opportunities we are facing today as a country and as a world. I guess I'm wondering, the piece about credentialing or learning for your own development is something that I think I find is really challenging to explain to people. Right? We are so conditioned to think of education as part of the economy, right? Or as part of a system of why I don't know what I want to do. So how do I have a major, and the idea being that higher education in general has to do with qualification for a job of some kind. So can you characterize maybe students that you've worked with there at IPC? Why are they there? How do they decide to do it? And how does it fit into their larger journeys, if you can generalize about that at all?
Yeah, I think students come and have come for all sorts of different reasons. I think initially they tended to be far more from a rural background, who were interested in global studies, but also in development and agricultural development. That was a big part of the school and its founding. And so they actually learned practical skills as well, but wanted to kind of broaden themselves in a very kind of traditional folk high school way. Over the years, it's become more, there's been a larger percentage of students that come on the so-called gap year. So after high school or gymnasium or whatever it is in their country, that they take a year off from their studies, oftentimes traveling around the world or at least around Europe, backpacking, that sort of thing, before settling down, quote unquote, and getting serious. So we do have quite a few of those, especially our European students. I think that's very common, or American or Australian students. Canadian students as well. But then I think particularly from our kind of non-Western countries, we have students who are very interested in actually, whether it's starting their own folk high school type institution back home, or really kind of seizing the core values of the school. The mission of the school speaks to them, and they want to, do something similar, right? So they are really inspired and really wanting to be active global citizens, or at least, active citizens in their own communities, and take that knowledge back with them. So it's a mix, and the levels change from term to term, but it's nice.
The Driftless Folk School, located in the beautiful rolling hills and valleys of southwest Wisconsin, is a community of lifelong learners dedicated to cultivating personal and cultural resilience through hands-on educational experiences. The Driftless Folk School offers classes in agriculture, land stewardship, natural history, folk arts and crafts, herbalism, wilderness skills, and more. For further information on the Driftless Folk School, visit us at driftlessfolkschool.org on the World Wide Web.
So that a question that we've been discussing here on the podcast before, that I think you're in a good position to answer. I mean, you to have an insight on, you kind of crafted this gap year in the midst of your university time for yourself in Paris, and what is the difference, or is there an advantage or disadvantage to doing what you did, essentially self-structuring something as opposed to joining a program like a folk high school or a gap year program of some kind?
Absolutely, yes, I would say. I think definitely I enjoyed my time in my gap year, and it was very memorable. As I said, I lived at the bookstore Shakespeare and Company for a while.
You definitely need to visit the bookstore here in town, which also has some connections to Shakespeare and Company.
Oh, really? Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, we have people here who, leaders in this community who spent some time out there in that same apartment.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I slept in the loft above the children's section, so that was my bed for a time. But yeah, so I mean, it was fantastic, but it was also for me, right? Again, this is my own, kind of experience and growth as an individual. Whereas I feel, and even study abroad programs, things like that, can offer that. But the folk high school is different because it's about more than just yourself. I think the idea of living in this kind of community. If you go to a summer camp, you can still be on your best behavior for a week, right? Maybe 2 weeks, right? But, slowly over time, like your real self shows through, right? You can't hide that for 4 months or 6 months, or a year. So you have to be real. And that kind of real vulnerability is so crucial because that's where power comes from, and you have to get to that place. To really, truly be able to stand on your own 2 feet and be comfortable in your own skin, and to do something for more than just yourself. And I think that is just the amount of joy that can bring for you and for the world is just so much more rewarding. So I think a school like IPC or in Thoreau College, as that you are starting out, that I think the opportunity there is just so vastly more than your own kind of personal travels and backpacking, and that's great too. Don't get me wrong. I definitely advocate your own soul searching and that sort of thing without any sort of agenda or purpose, and just kind of go. But there's a time to kind of put that aside and become part of humanity. That we are our greatest when we work together. And in fact, that is, as an anthropologist, I can say, as this is what it truly means to be human. If you really want to feel it, being in community with others and doing something greater than yourself that's where it's at, Yeah.
Amen. That was beautiful. I wonder maybe to continue to paint this picture of what life is like there. So this third leg, this participatory governance, citizenship, living together in practical ways. How does that actually happen at IPC?
Generally with some sort of breakdown. I mean, we take a bunch of students from all over the world, and teachers and just people, and, they all have different cultures and different standards and ideas about what's right and what's wrong, and it's this experiment every single time, and something will break down. As I said before, generally it's with the student kitchen, but who knows, maybe it's with the bike rentals, whatever it is, and meetings have to be had, and someone gets fed up, and, and they take a stand. they hit the moment where that's too much, and now a town hall has been called, and now they start to be active. And for the first month or two, or even more sometimes, it's the motions. They hear it, yeah, we know what this is about, right? But it starts to get real around
When it
month
hits the
3.
fan, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's something real that in their community, their life, that needs to be solved. And that is really special to see, how they come and they start to formulate their opinions and work to solve these issues is it's always beautiful to me, actually.
So, a question that's fascinating. I really am in agreement and see that as that moment, whenever it is, when the crisis happens. We don't know exactly what it's going to be, but it has to happen if the realness is going to happen, right? The growth is going to happen. So one thing that we're asking here at Thoreau College is when you have a group of students who are just coming together for the first time, they're here for a few months or even for a year, but there's not a student body that's continuing between year to year. How do those institutions, how do the kind of skills of communication, of conflict resolution, of having a meeting, how are those held, and how are they, when the crisis happens, how are they introduced?
Every time it's a little bit different. There's that flexibility there. I actually teach a class on conflict resolution, and so there's hopefully by that point some have some skills to deal with that. We have a kind of a team norms, community norms meeting at the start about what they want their community to be about. But again, until it becomes real, those are just words.
Right.
And so with the latest issue that happened this term, when we talked about, this is in the policy you had at the start of the term, they're like, oh, we never read that. This is the first time I'm hearing about that. Okay, so the preparedness, you can do as much as you want, but it really has to come organically through the experience, and I think as teachers, as the staff that kind of create this environment, we have to allow for that moment and be there, not to intervene, but to allow them and to provide the environment for the students to find their own solutions and find their own empowerment and work through that as a group and as individuals. I think that is, if we can give them anything, we have to give them that, or we fail as teachers, right? If we try to give them the answers and it's the guidance. If they don't want it from us, then that's okay too. And I think that's also hard as teachers, to step back and allow them the space to do it themselves.
When you've seen the dishes fight come up again for the 35th or 100th time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So when you're teaching conflict resolution, are there particular modalities or philosophies that you're working with there?
Yeah, we do a lot with Marshall Rosenberg, the nonviolent communication. I have a theater background, so I enjoy theater for conflict transformation or forum theater, and I think both they kind of work well in tandem. And other things that the students are interested in. Brene Brown often comes up. We watch different TED Talks and things. I think Simon Sinek is another. Kind of more recent philosopher, modern day, kind of looking at some of these issues.
It's interesting to know that IPC has a Quaker root somewhere in there. Do you work with consensus decision making?
We do, yeah, absolutely. So while there is at the kind of administrative level, there are certain things that are kind of beyond consensus, if you will. Simply they have to comply with law and that sort of thing. But in every way possible, decisions are made with through consensus, particularly term to term. So students, the hard part about it though is, again, you can't hold someone's hand and say, okay, well now you must do this yourself. They have to actually actively want it, right? So I had a student or two students this term who there was a holiday from their country that was not observed at the school, and they were very upset about it and said, hey, this is a peace school and this was, something very important that happened in our country, and why aren't you observing it? And I had to say, well, if this is something you would like, we absolutely support you, but we will not celebrate the holiday ourselves. We will not create that as an institution. It's whatever you find important. You must, embrace and actively create yourself. And they were like, oh, well, this student over here was, celebrating their own holiday or whatever it is. And it's like, well, that student actually actively requested and made a, active attempts to create that celebration, and so we supported it, and we will do the same for you. And so that's hard. I think we're in many cultures, I know in the United States, we're actually taught to be passive, and that's a traditional education system, right? This is, you're taught to fit into the box, right? And we're actually teaching the opposite. So, but you can't really guide that, right? That has to be found. And so that's the difficulty, but once students start to catch on to that, then they really, I find, will run with it. So.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I think that it's something that we observe about our programs here. I think that, and we observe in our world, is that it seems to be harder and harder for people to have conversations across cultural differences, whether they are international cultural differences or they are, let's say, political or they are philosophical or ideological. Are you working actively with those kind of divisions there? Is there changes over time with that, or is that it seems inherent in bringing a bunch of people in a bunch of countries together? Yeah,
absolutely. And actually, in the example that I was using, the one student was from Israel and the other student was not from Palestine, actually from Afghanistan, but it was a kind of religious differences and from a very sensitive part of the world, and where they grabbed onto it and said, oh well, if you give attention to this, you must give attention to that, and so again, that we do have to be very sensitive to those issues, absolutely. Yeah. But again, giving empowerment and the opportunity for students to create their own empowerment is the most important thing.
Yeah. Fascinating. So I know an important part of life in a community, and I know it's an important part of the idea of the folk high schools, are forms of shared culture, of celebration, of singing. I wonder if you could describe that life of the IPC.
Yeah, absolutely. So we begin each day with a morning fellowship, which is, so it begins with a song, and we do some news, and then different kind of programs of the day. So maybe by students, maybe by faculty, whoever has something they want to share. Sometimes it's cleaning, so we twice a week have to clean areas of the school. Each of the 100 students, they're divided into, at this point, I think 9 different groups called contact groups. Each is with their own teacher, and so together, so it's about 10 or 11 students, and they have a different area of the school that they are responsible for. They meet and do different activities together. We have something called life stories that we do 3 times a term with our contact groups, where the first they talk about their grandparents and their parents. The second, they talk about their own childhood, and the third, their hopes and dreams for the future. And that's a really powerful one to go through, through the term as they get to know each other. And so that really creates a sense of fellowship and, as I say, the fellesskap, right? This community building. So that's a big part of it. We also do washing up after dinner together, after meals. So cleaning is a very big part. Working for peace, again, working side by side is very important. And different activities.
The hands, part of the head art and hands there. Are there other sort of manual or like physical sorts of components of things that everyone is doing?
Yeah, generally during the kind of midterm transition, sometimes we'll have students leave halfway after 3 months, and then new students come in, or even just kind of at the midway point in the term, where we do community work, so chopping firewood or weeding gardens or whatever needs to be done at the time. Doing a bit more, extra work in that respect. Also at the end of the term, it's not quite as large of a component as it used to be. Apparently, at the start, students were doing 5 hours a day.
Wow.
Their mornings were all about building the school, and their afternoons then they would have lecture and study.
That's a fascinating element of this as I learn more about the Danish folk high school model. Like, so what we're doing here at Thoreau College, taking our inspiration from Deep Springs. Labor is a really important piece. I mean, Deep Springs and some periods of time here at Thoreau College, there have been something like 3 or 4 hours a day of labor, and that is it's one of the kind of the key pillars here. And it sounds my sense is that was formerly a much more central part of the Danish folk high schools and has in some ways changed over time.
Yeah, I think part of it is simply the student body has changed. I mean, like I said earlier, so I think in 1928, our students at the college actually built our lecture hall with their own hands, and everything with no other outside help. And
it's still standing up.
It's still standing. It's beautiful. It's still used to this day. But they also had the skills. Right. I mean, the students coming these days.
They were coming off of the farms.
Exactly.
Out of the villages. Yeah.
Exactly. And the property was much larger at that time. They had bought an old farmhouse, and so there's a big old barn. And over the years, some of that property has been sold off for various reasons, building new buildings and that sort of thing. So I think that's about 5 acres now, 5 to 10 acres. I can't remember exactly. But it used to be, I think, around 20 acres of land. Wow. So it was a functioning farm to begin with. There were animals, there were horses and cows and all sorts of things, and actual farmland that they grew everything themselves. Yeah. So women at the college would be doing a lot more of the kind of the farming or with the gardens and the cooking, and the men would be building the actual structures and things like that, and kind of some more of the manual labor. But yeah, nowadays our students simply don't have those skills. And in fact, because a lot of the work that I do is with cultural heritage, we do exhibitions, and we did an exhibition for the Jubilee, just kind of commemorating the history of the school. And many of the students it was a volunteer project, and so they had a number of students who came to help out, and who had never used a saw. They'd never used a hammer. They'd, a screwdriver was, I can't tell you how many videos and photos I had to take of people to send to their parents that they painted a wall and they, so just learning how to do those manual things, they yearn for it. But it's not part of daily life in most cultures anymore.
Is it part of the curriculum, or I mean, maybe you could say a bit more about what sorts of subject matters are covered, are on offer there? I mean, so you're teaching what sounds like essentially an academic class, or a social skills class, or conflict resolution, but Middle East studies, that sounds like you could say academic in some sense. But when people in the United States who have heard of folk schools probably have in mind something that is very like craft oriented, folk arts, maybe homesteading skills. Is that part of the curriculum there, or like what are some of the classes that are offered?
So actually not so much. We do have an arts and crafts class where students can try different things. But for the most part, it's a mix. We have the arts, we have theater, we also have choir, which is very important. We have architecture and design. We have tabletop gaming, which is a popular class these days, podcasting and movie making, a lot of different academic classes. We are an international school, and that is our remit. So we have classes called things like Us and Them, People on the Move, which is a migration class, and other things that I teach as well. Outdoor classes, so outdoor life, something called friluftsliv, is outdoor living, is very, very popular in the Nordic countries. So camping and a lot of camp type activities. Gardening, sustainable gardening is another, development management, so they can learn, that's an extended class. Some other folk high schools have actual core programs, and then you would choose, between, let's say, 4 or 5 or maybe 6 different core programs, and then some electives to balance it out. Ours is more of a general nature, so it's like a kind of a buffet style. Students can choose whatever they like, and they simply have to have 28 lessons per week, and certain classes every morning and every afternoon and things like that. But we have also African drum and dance. What else? I think 42 or so, right around 40 classes each term, and they change depending on the faculty, but a diverse range.
My sense is that students are keeping their week is very full. But and I think as we've experimented here at Thoreau College, the schedule actually has been one of the hardest things. How being inspired by Henry David Thoreau, some element of solitude seems to be important, and how do you do that in the context of intensive community? Can you what is a typical day like there for a student?
It is pretty intensive, and actually that is something our students struggle with, and because we do still have to meet certain legal requirements, so the opportunity for solitude is not so readily available for some. But we do have a garden, that they can go into and kind of wander about, and we're near the woods as well, so they can get away that way. But yeah, so classes, there's two kind of time slots in the morning and 2 in the afternoon on most days. And then evening activities most nights of the week, right? So we have an afternoon fellowship, which is a more extended program for community building on Wednesdays. And then maybe there's lectures, or maybe there's clubs or different activities, all sorts of things happening during the other weekday evenings, movies and that sort of thing. I think 5 times a term we have something called a cultural evening. So basically arranged by region. And so there's maybe 20, 25 students who then work together to put on a cultural evening, kind of edutainment for the others. And so those happen actually quite frequently, and they're preparing for that and those activities. So they do have quite a bit on their plates. It is a bit of a whirlwind, but they still have time to have fun and, and go travel and that sort of thing. And we try to also work that into the timetable and allow for that.
Thoreau College is a leader in an emergent movement dedicated to the renewal and revitalization of higher education through the creation of new, humanly scaled institutions with holistic curricula known as microcolleges. Thoreau College, higher education for the whole human being.
Yeah, we're coming up towards the end of our time frame here. I wanted to ask, being that you are, you're an anthropologist, you're cross-cultural, you've lived and taught and worked in different cultures and countries, you've come out of the American education system, and I guess if we we're trying to learn from the example of the Danish folk high schools and the IPC, what needs to happen? How could that model be implemented here in the United States?
That's a tricky one. I think, as I say, I think Grundtvig, who talks about, the fact that the folk high school idea is something that's eminently exportable but non-translatable, right? And what he means, it's something that is very uniquely Danish, right? And Nordic, right? And so also
there are folk high schools across Scandinavia.
Exactly, right? So it really has taken hold. But each of them has their own unique twist on it, right? Mm-hmm. So I love, for example, in the Swedish folk high schools, they don't have students, they have participants. Uh-huh. So just simply having a different name for the, and then in my mind I thought, well, why stop at participant? Why not just talk about community members, right? That we're all community members, with different roles to play in the community. So I found that intriguing, But I think each country, each individual, who wants to start a community like this, a school like this, needs to find their own way. I think it has to be organic. It has to fit the time and the place that it's in. And I think it draw on the ideas of Grundtvig and the folk high schools from Denmark, but also the native sons as well, and other ideas, and draw liberally, if there's a good idea that works where you are, I think go with it. And I think, whatever can actually create that empowerment is there's no one right way, as they'd say in the Vedas, but there's many paths to truth.
So fantastic. I guess my last question, I think this may be circling back to the beginning, to even before you went off to Paris. When we were talking here, you mentioned an important part of your development as a person was the why in summer camps.
Yes.
And so there's a way that what you're describing at IPC, it sounds like the most glorious adult summer camp that you can imagine. Could you talk about that and what kind of the sense of fellowship, a sense of atmosphere that's created at a place like a summer camp or like this? How has that shaped your life?
In monumental ways. In ways I think when I was experiencing it, I couldn't anticipate or expect very profoundly. So I started actually volunteering at a Phantom Lake YMCA camp in Mugwanago, Wisconsin, when I was 12 years old. A friend of mine had just read an ad in the paper, and she wanted to do it, but she didn't want to do it alone. So she asked me to join. I had never heard of the camp. I didn't think much of it. And I was hooked, much as with IPC. As soon as I stepped foot in the camp, I just knew that this was a place for me. And in fact, they have in the dining hall a sign that says, sometimes the only way to find out who you really are is to get to a place where you don't have to be anything else. And that is something that stayed with me all my life. So I volunteered at the day camp for most of my teenage years, then eventually became an actual counselor when I turned 18. First day camp, then resident camp. And I think there is just something magical about being with a group of people, particularly in nature, and without, cell phones, without televisions, without all that distraction, and just being in the presence of others. That is just indescribable. And I think that sense of community is so special. I mean, I think everyone should experience it. More than once in their lifetime, again and again, just dip
Lifelong.
in the pool. Exactly. And so, I think when I finally did eventually arrive at IPC, again, it just felt, like home, in many ways, right? It was very much in alignment. The philosophy, the ideas behind it, and the mode of living were very much in alignment. And I think that's quite a beautiful thing. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, you've been listening to Microcollege, the podcast. Our guest today has been Julie Shackelford, Wisconsin native, instructor at the International People's College in Elsinore, Denmark. What a treat. Thank you for stopping by our little town here in Viroqua today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.